The Last of Us Part 2 has swept the internet with what can only be described as a Marmite effect. Some people love it, but other people hate it. There's a crowd of people that love the game, and I can see why, and there's also a crowd of people that absolutely despise it, and I can also see why. But I'll never understand why everybody's at each other's throats over opinions on a video game. It's almost like we're on the internet. Even before the game was out, people were hating it, courtesy of leaked spoilers, which, if you went out of your way to look for, that's nobody's fault but your own, and if you spoiled it for others, then you're a massive I don't know how in context those spoilers are because I wasn't the kind of imbecile that looked for them, and while those spoilers did wind up being true, I think it's important to register them in context, as idiots spewing them at you in text form really doesn't do them justice. I'm going to treat this review in a more laid back sense than some of my other reviews on games in the past, because this is the only real opportunity I'll get to actually lay out my thoughts. I tried to in the spoiler chat we set up on the Discord, but I quickly realised it was suffering from the same effect as everywhere else I've seen. Nobody's making any sense, and I likely won't either, and trying to make sense of other people's opinions before forming your own has proven to be counterproductive, and from that I don't even know why I'm making this video myself beyond needing to get my thoughts out somewhere without somebody shouting at me, "The Last of Us too bad!" Because though I don't necessarily think it's the best game that I've ever played, it's certainly a far cry from bad. Either way, I hope this review helps articulate my points in a way that makes at least some sense. But first, before we get cracking, I just want to say that this video is sponsored by Ridge Wallet, who sent me this lovely compact wallet. No more carrying around a big, chunky, obnoxious wallet that bulges in your pants. The Ridge Wallet is subtle and efficient, making it fashionable. The wallet holds up to 12 cards plus space for cash. It comes in over 30 different colours, including carbon fibre and burnt titanium, meaning you can get one that looks right for you. I chose the aluminium navy option because I quite like the colour blue. On top of all this, the Ridge Wallet is incredibly durable and comes with a lifetime warranty. In theory, it could outlive you. So if you can't be bothered splashing on a new wallet every single time your old one falls apart, then definitely check these bad boys out. Look at all the space you'll be saving in your pocket. On top of this, the wallet is made with RFID blocking technology, which protects you from digital pickpocketers. The Ridge has over 30,000 5-star reviews. You can trust them to deliver a quality product. And on top of that, you can test the Ridge Wallet for a 45-day trial, and if you're not satisfied, you can send it back for a full refund. Use the code Fizhy for 10% off with free worldwide shipping and returns over at ridge.com/Fizhy. You'll be able to find the link and the code in the description and comments as well. But now, back to the video. I think before we even begin to talk about The Last of Us Part 2 as a game, we need to talk about its predecessor, The Last of Us. Released in 2013, The Last of Us is a narrative masterpiece, in which we go on a journey with two characters, Joel and a child, Ellie, and we see them develop as characters individually, and we see their bond, as they find themselves in a journey across parts of the post-apocalyptic United States, where civilization as we know it has been destroyed by the cordyceps fungus, which is basically a zombie trope. People go, technically it's not, but it just is. I hate zombie tropes with a passion, however I think this is the best one I've seen executed in all of media, at least when it comes to a serious narrative. In order to cut a lot of fast short, I think it's fair to say that The Last of Us sets an incredibly high bar, giving us an incredible character-driven story, delivered in a world full of moral greys, albeit from a relatively restricted perspective. Truth be told, I only played through The Last of Us for the first time back in October of last year. I really did enjoy the experience, but the only reasons I really bring this up is because it's still relatively fresh in my mind, and unlike some others, I haven't been waiting for a sequel for 7 years, so I understand that by comparison to some people, my expectations going into The Last of Us Part 2 were quite mild. I just want to issue a massive spoiler warning before we get too deep into this. While I don't necessarily plan on touching down on every single spoiler in the game, there are a few big ones that need discussing, and in a linear narrative game, spoilers are quite hard to avoid talking about. I recommend playing the game anyway before you hear my thoughts so you can form your own opinion. But anyway, let's get into mine. When I finished The Last of Us Part 2, I think the soundest way to describe how I felt was numb. And the more I think about it, the more I realise that was intentional. Narratively speaking, this game's story felt vastly different from that of the first game, which was a character-driven journey with a linear perspective. And while The Last of Us Part 2 is also character-driven, it's also more static, with most of the game taking place in Seattle. On top of this, there are two key perspectives and multiple recurring characters. The two key perspectives we get are that of Ellie and that of Abby. Obviously, Ellie is a great character carried over from The Last of Us, and Abby, dare I say, is an interesting character in her own right as well. Both these characters have their own story. We'll get more into that in a moment, but we do need to address the elephant in the room. In the opening couple hours of The Last of Us Part 2, unless you looked at the spoilers or got spoiled, the game catches us completely off guard as Abby kills Joel.
Joel, please get up! No! Fucking kill you.
Fucking hell. This is a very bold narrative decision, and whether or not the story is any good depends entirely on what happens over the course of the rest of the game. This isn't the last we see of Joel in this game. We see him in plenty of flashbacks, in which we see the effects of the end of the first game play out. I think the controversial side of this is we play as Joel in The Last of Us, and we expected him to be around for a little bit longer, and the marketing suggested as such as well, with Joel showing up seemingly to help Ellie on her revenge mission. However, in the actual game, it's Jesse who shows up here, as Joel is already dead. Now, I get being lied to by the marketing is a little bit on the iffy side. I don't really have a problem with it, however, though I do think it is a bit weird, don't get me wrong. Fabricating a moment that does not happen in the story for marketing purposes to avoid giving too much away is a pretty wise move when out of context nobody will actually understand or like the sound of the story that they're trying to go for. And I think when spoilers leaked, that proved that decision correct. Love it or hate it, Joel's death spurs Ellie on. After experiencing these two characters develop a bond in The Last of Us, I can't say that it's not compelling. In my opinion, it would have been a lot less compelling had they just created a fresh character to kill off in the opening hours as a driving force for the narrative. It's not what I expected to happen, and it's certainly not what I wanted to happen, but I still see it as strong storytelling. What I'm trying to say in my overly convoluted way is this feels like a genuine loss, and as a result I feel Ellie's desire for revenge. She's on the hunt for Abby, the other character that we get to play as, but more on that in a moment. And this takes the story to the city of Seattle, where most of the game after the fact takes place. I won't go over every detail, but we get to experience 3 days in Seattle with Ellie, which makes up the first half, roughly, of the game. At several points, Ellie is accompanied by 3 key characters. You've got Dina, which is Ellie's sort of romantic interest, if you will. She's a useful character up until the point where she reveals that she thinks she's pregnant and then she's just not. Then you've got Tommy, who is Joel's brother, who was present in The Last of Us, which makes him a returning character, so there's a bit of connect between the two games there. Then you've got Jesse, who isn't the most riveting character of all time, but I suppose he serves his purpose. And over the course of these chapters, you get several flashbacks to moments between Ellie and Joel, and so even though Joel dies really early, he still plays a large role in the overall narrative. It drives the story forward with an emotional incentive. The game constantly reminds you of the loss that Ellie has experienced. This keeps us focused on the revenge mission that Ellie's on, where we feel her hatred and her desire to get what she sees as justice for Joel. At the same time, the game maintains the fact that it's simply not a morality tale, and it's not really a case of good and bad, it's simply revenge, and we see it take Ellie down a really dark path. In a similar way to how it doesn't make Joel a good person in The Last of Us, it doesn't make Ellie a good person here. Like I said, it's not about morality, for Ellie it's about simple revenge, and that I think plays into part of the overall moral of the narrative. Obviously, these 3 days in Seattle with Ellie build up to this confrontation with Abby. From here, instead of going into a confrontation gameplay set piece, we instead find ourselves experiencing those same 3 days, but as Abby, who also has flashback segments where we learn about why she killed Joel. As it turns out, Abby's father was one of the surgeons who was to operate on Ellie to remove her brain in order to study a cure/vaccine for the cordyceps. And obviously, as Joel at the end of The Last of Us, we kill him. And so all of the events in The Last of Us Part 2 are fallout for the end of The Last of Us. This makes a lot more sense than Abby simply being a character that they pulled out of nowhere, and again maintains that connection to the story of The Last of Us. In Abby's chapters, I did find myself taking quite a lot of breaks. I think it's fair to say that the Abby chapters unnaturally shift the momentum a little bit, but I will say some of the set pieces in these chapters are the best in the game, and as much as these points terrified me, that is the point of survival horror. Abby's chapters are quite densely packed with these great moments, and in my opinion, it sort of makes up for that disconnect of momentum momentum that switching from Ellie to her creates. Furthermore, these Abby segments show you Abby as a character experiencing her post-revenge sort of life, and in these segments you realise that in this story there is no bad guy, and the revenge that Ellie seeks will bring her no peace, just as killing Joel brought Abby no peace. On top of this, in the Abby chapters we also get to experience the characters that we see present at the beginning of The Last of Us Part 2, who were there when Abby killed Joel, some of whom by this point we've already killed as Ellie, and the game makes an effort to not present them as antagonists or even anti-heroes. They're just human. In this post-apocalyptic backdrop, people may be driven to do bad things in order to survive, but that doesn't make them inherently good or bad. If anything, everyone in this game is a fucking monster considering the amount of brutal methods you can use to kill dogs, but I digress. So with Abby, we see what she does over the course of these 3 games, with the climax being the same moment that we saw at the end of the 3 Ellie days that we got. Between characters in Ellie's part of the story and characters in Abby's part of the story, there is some mirroring going on. For example, Mel is also pregnant, and she's still getting on with it fighting Seraphites, and honestly it makes limited sense. However, all the characters give Mel an out, and she just chooses to get on with it, so it's not like the game's brushing over that and trying not to make sense. The death of one of the characters seems to mirror one of the deaths of one of Ellie's companions. I shan't get into that right now because I don't want to get into every single spoiler going if I can help it. We'll be here all day. That's just how it is. My point is there's a lot of mirroring going on. Abby and Ellie have both walked the revenge path, however, Abby is further along, and we're seeing that impact on her. Though that change of momentum can really break down the feeling, the narrative here is still just as compelling as it was with Ellie. Though absolutely I do agree with people that say that the structuring feels a little bit weird here. The game has us play out the confrontation between Abby and Ellie as Abby, and it reminded me a little bit of the David fight from The Last of Us. I'm gonna be honest, I was frightened of Ellie in this. I guess this moment is deliberately quite tough, as here are 2 characters that are both compelling that we see come to blows over something that we know is a vicious cycle. The game doesn't kill Abby nor Ellie here, despite Abby sort of winning the confrontation. This is where the revenge cycle of Joel killed Abby's father, Abby killed Joel, Ellie killed Abby's friends, and it could go on, is ended, at least for Abby's sake, and she moves on. It's a very impactful moment in which it seems like Abby realises that though she wants to take revenge, she already knows that it won't achieve anything, will only cause more harm than good in the long run, as her successful attempt at taking revenge against Joel resulted in the death of her friends. This shows us the humanity of the characters and leaves us back with Ellie and Dina, who attempt to move on. And though Ellie tries to put it behind her, she can't 100%, and it haunts her. And I guess that's good because there's no satisfaction for Ellie just yet. She can't just drop it. She desperately wants to, but she just can't. Even though if she continues to pursue revenge, she will lose Dina and Dina's son JJ, as they simply can't follow her down this path of revenge anymore. However, Ellie goes on anyway. To cut a little bit of fluff short, she does in fact find Abby, and they have a little bit of a scrap. However, eventually Ellie realises that revenge won't do anything for her. Of course, not before Abby gnaws off 2 of her fingers, but she realises that killing Abby won't bring Joel back, nor will it fix her life. And there's a lot of drama and power behind it. She then returns home to find that it's empty, and Dina and JJ are gone. The ending is not satisfying, nor is it really intended to be. The moral is, revenge consumed Ellie and ruined her life in a similar sense to how it consumed Abby and wound up ruining her life. There's no happy ending. There wasn't a happy ending to The Last of Us. This continues on that. And like I said, when I finished this game, I felt incredibly numb. And that ending still makes me feel numb because part of me still doesn't quite know what to make of it. I feel like the game intended for this ending. And who knows, maybe it'll play into a 3rd part for this story in the years to come. I don't know if I'd say it was a good or bad ending. It was just an ending. It worked within the confines of the story, but it didn't deliver any satisfaction, and while the story could very easily be complete here, I'm still not entirely sure if it is. Narratively, this game is overall intended to mess with your emotions, and it delivers on doing that, which is the intent of the writers. When you feel so attached to a character and bad stuff happens to that character, you feel the full force of that. This story doesn't deal in many cliches. There's no moral compass, there's no good and there's no bad. The world that we're placed in The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2 is pure grey. I suppose it's very bold storytelling. Some people like it and others don't, and that's absolutely fine. The Last of Us as a story was more about the journey than what happened at the end. And then the ending sprung into this story, which doesn't necessarily feel like a journey, but it feels like the massive chunk in the middle where we play as Ellie and Abby are more important to the story's moral than the end is. That moral being nobody's inherently good and nobody's inherently evil. I do apologise, I don't think I'll ever be able to concisely express my opinions for the narrative in The Last of Us Part 2, but I do think the story achieved what it intended to tell, and I was invested in experiencing it. Now, I know the story's a lot to digest when talking about The Last of Us Part 2, and sometimes it feels like all there is to actually talk about. There are certain aspects of gameplay that need discussing as well. The Last of Us Part 2's gameplay is pretty smooth and cinematic. It looks good and for the most part plays really well. There are certain aspects that feel a little bit awkward and heavy, especially when in combat in my opinion, but a lot of these things can be addressed as you upgrade your skills, which you unlock as you go. The environments that you explore aren't just there as visuals, you can find letters and things which detail the lives of those who may have lived here once. There's no obligation to check out all of it, but you can do if you want to. You'll naturally find a lot of these letters as you explore when you look for resources and things to pick up, which is a key part of the gameplay, as when you move through areas you'll find yourself doing this all the time. Some might argue far too much, but in my opinion you would look for these resources in the post-apocalypse since they are scarce. However, I do find it a bit annoying that the game limits how much ammunition you can carry to quite small amounts, especially when you've got a big ass fucking rucksack on your back. As you explore through areas you may come across safes which have resources inside them. However, you need to figure out what the passcode is to get in. The game lays down environmental clues that help you figure out what that actually is. So using your observation to look around as you go is beneficial because you're rewarded for doing so. Moving on, the infected are still terrifying in this game, so I suppose that's a win. And my hatred for clickers is still incredibly strong. That being said, my run-in with the Rat King gave me a good appreciation for clickers. What I like about this is The Last of Us Part 2 goes beyond a regular zombie trope. While I hate zombies with a passion, what they do in The Last of Us is create their own take on this genre. We're never overwhelmed with infected. The suspense that we get instead adds to the survival horror aspect, and I think it's quite well delivered. Just like how in the first game the different types of infected require different strategies to take down. In stealth, the slower and quieter you are, the more likely you are to succeed. In combat, you've got to be mindful of your limited resources and avoid getting too close to certain infected types, otherwise things get ugly really quickly. Though this isn't too dissimilar to the first game, the game does spice it up with new infected types. When it comes to facing non-infected foes, combat usually finds you in shootouts with the occasional piece of melee in the middle. Beating people to death in this game feels really satisfying, I will say that. You can quite easily get overwhelmed, so you need to be careful, and if you get shot you get staggered, so if you're directly charging at your enemy, you're not going to make it. At least not without sacrificing some health unnecessarily. It's typical unremarkable combat for the most part. Not saying it's not good, just saying I don't know what I'd say about it per se. However, there are different enemy types within the non-infected that stem from dogs to people with guns to massive people with hammers, and so yes, you are still required to be tactical. I do quite like what the game goes for with the stealth aspect when facing non-infected enemy types. No stealth tactic is 100% foolproof, so in order to maintain being undetected, you need to ensure that you switch it up, otherwise you'll be discovered. Even if you're hidden, dogs will be able to smell you and follow your trail right until they find you. On top of this, if enemies get too close while you're hidden, they may detect you then. However, you have plenty of tools and crafting opportunities that you can utilize to your advantage in both stealth and combat, to be fair. In the earlier stealth parts of the game, one of my gripes was that the takedowns felt like they took too long. Apparently there's a perk that speeds it up, and while that's cool, I'd also like a perk that speeds up the fucking loading screen, but perks you can apply help you in both combat, in stealth, in crafting, and are tracked separately for Abby and Ellie. You can upgrade your weaponry to be more efficient, to carry more ammunition, to handle better, to fire faster, to do more damage or have a scope, and so on and so forth. Unlocking abilities and upgrading your weaponry and crafting gear such as medkits or bombs can really make your life a whole lot easier. You can even craft a makeshift silencer for your pistol, which is incredibly useful in stealth. Though when you craft one, it can only hack 3 shots before it breaks, and you'll need to craft a new one. As Ellie, you don't need to craft shivs because she has a knife, however as Abby you do. And the knife slash the shivs are useful for taking down clickers, and anyone else who gets in your way, I guess. Moving on, when it comes to difficulty, The Last of Us Part 2's gameplay is quite accessible. Not only do you have different difficulty settings, you can customize them a little bit. You can alter the balance of the amount of resources that you find, or the aggression of your enemies, or the damage that you sustain, or the damage that your allies do, all individually, which means the game accounts for all kinds of players, those who want a massive challenge, those that don't necessarily want too much challenge, or those that just hate challenge altogether. And while easy, normal and hard difficulty settings usually account for that, I think it's fair to say that altering certain aspects of the difficulty can help make the game far more accessible. As far as navigation through areas is concerned, for the most part it's fine. There are, however, some areas where I struggled to figure out where I needed to go next. There were a couple of spots where I was stuck for a little bit trying to figure out what now, so it's probably more the fault of my stupidity than the game's fault for its world design, so I'll leave that point there, because for the most part, travelling from A to B in this game is relatively simple, not in the difficulty sense, but in the simple to follow sense. I've already mentioned that this game has some fantastic set pieces, a lot of which are actually in the Abby chapters, and there's nothing really to complain about there. On the front of performance, I won't bother talking about the frame rate because it's not really that important. The game is very clearly playable, and we're on the dying breaths of the generation anyway. But on the bugs and glitches front, I really didn't encounter very many. Sure, there is the odd moment, but in the end of the day, no video game is going to be polished to the point where you won't encounter any bugs or any jank whatsoever. I can't think of any noticeable game-breaking moments that I've encountered. However, there was one moment where where I was trapped behind a horse and had to reload my save in order to progress. I will say that though few and far between, loading screens in this game can be quite long, like the best part of a minute long, and while I've experienced loading screens of this length in other games anyway, it's always a little bit bothersome to be staring at an uninteresting screen for a solid minute. That being said, this is likely not a problem with the game itself, but instead the power of the PlayStation 4. I played on a PlayStation 4 Pro with boost mode enabled, so I'll chalk this down to being the performance knocks you get at the dying breath of the generation, as I've mentioned a couple times already. Research tells me that The Last of Us 2 will probably be playable on the PlayStation 5, so I don't doubt that will resolve the loading screen issue. So I shan't complain too heavily about the loading screens, and they're not too frequent anyway, so it's quite easy to ignore. Graphically, this game looks incredible. The visuals are magnificent, and the game utilises this to add to the drama and the atmosphere. The visuals hold up in characters' faces quite well. They still look quite nice. A lot of games have odd character faces. For the most part in this game, they hold up. One thing I'd argue in this game that really adds to the visuals is the weather. Nice looking weather is always a great finishing touch on a game's atmosphere. Any game with great visuals these days needs a photo mode. It is the law. The Last of Us Part 2 has indeed got a photo mode in which you can alter various different things to get lovely shots, and honestly, that's a win in my books. I always love messing about with photo modes in games, and in The Last of Us Part 2 it's no different, even if I only have the artistic understanding of the goon who drew penises in the back of school textbooks. And finally, The Last of Us Part 2 has a rather lovely soundtrack. In story games especially like this, it's important to never underestimate the impact a soundtrack can have, and The Last of Us Part 2 soundtrack functions as a great complement to the story. Typically being quite suspenseful, it helps highlight that drama. So ultimately, as far as gameplay and games go, The Last of Us Part 2 is undeniably quite good, if not fantastic. Gameplay is fun, challenging and well balanced, the elements of survival horror are all there, the visuals are stunning, the game is well polished, the soundtrack is great, and the game nails its atmosphere. It would appear as if the key issue that makes the game so divisive among players is the incredibly bold narrative that some people love and some people hate, and that's absolutely fine. I suppose whether or not the game does right by you is up to your preferences in storytelling. Feel free to express those down in the comments section, by the way. I won't sit here and pretend this game is perfect, it certainly is not, but for what it's worth, I really did enjoy my experience in The Last of Us Part 2. Thus concluding my review, I don't really want to give this game a number rating because number ratings are incredibly redundant when you realise that anything below 7 out of 10 means the game practically sucks, and the number rating doesn't make sense anyway when there's no real definition for what qualifies as what. This game got a lot of 10 out of 10s from reviewers, and I don't necessarily think I'd agree with that, but I don't even remotely think this game was bad. That's my opinion, please don't crucify me. Of course, let me know your opinions down in the comment section. What do you think about this game? Let me have it. Iron out your entire thoughts if you want to. I'll do my best to read the comments as much as I possibly can. But if we can keep it somewhat respectful, I think that'll be a great step towards achieving an intelligent discussion about this game, because honestly, I haven't seen very many of those just yet. But anyway, that concludes today's video. Thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends and all that wonderful stuff, that would be fantastic. I apologise if at any point my opinions seemed a bit rambly. Like I said, I wanted to approach this video in a more relaxed way to avoid having a brain hemorrhage. But hopefully this video has been a good insight into my opinions for you guys. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and with any luck, I will see you all very soon with another video at some point. But until then, goodbye.